Thank you so much for being here. Molly Guptill Manning.
Hello.
Okay, so I wanted to start this conversation off with a quote I think most of you are familiar with. Books are a weapon, books are weapons in the war of ideas. Is that still true?
I think that is still true. So FDR actually made that statement in 1943. And it was to think about what had happened 10 years earlier. So in May of 1933, across Germany, there were book burnings. And the idea was that we could take ideas off the shelves and destroy them. And then people wouldn't think about those things, and we'd all be thinking similar, and in that case, things based on Nazi ideologies, and there wouldn't be any protest. And one way to combat that, FDR thought, and also American librarians thought, was to read, was to practice the freedom of expression and the freedom to read in the United States. And so he made a speech in 1943, basically encouraging Americans to protest what was happening and to participate in democracy by reading anything that they wanted to, because he thought books are weapons in this war of ideas. And as ideas are being taken off of shelves, we're going to take ideas off of shelves but read them instead of destroy them.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump into your book here. So what inspired you to write this book? I have to say, I was pleasantly surprised reading this book. I was a little nervous because I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination, but I could not stop reading it.
Oh,
so
you.
what inspired you to write about books and the war and soldiers?
So my first book that I ever wrote was about this author named Arthur Train, which probably nobody has heard of him. But he was the John Grisham of the early 20th century. He would write about these courtroom battles, and it was one of the only ways that people would have access to this idea of like how is justice working and how does it work. But he ended up inventing this character named Ephraim Tutt. And Ephraim Tutt was this lawyer who always did the morally satisfying thing. Like he'd always find a way where if somebody committed a crime, but there was a really good reason for it because they were actually trying to do something good, he'd figure out some kind of novel strategy to get them acquitted. Well, 20 years after that character was created, Train felt that he wanted the character to basically live on forever because Train's health was declining. So he wrote the autobiography of the character. So he wrote the autobiography of Ephraim Tutt. He copyrighted it in Tutt's name. He wrote a foreword to the book saying, "I have finally convinced my good friend Tutt to write his autobiography." And it was just a massive literary hoax. It fooled everybody. But that book was the product of all of these letters that were in the archives. And the letters were from soldiers fighting World War II. And they were saying, you know, we're confused. We thought Tutt was a character, and it seems like he's actually a person because you have an autobiography of him. And the letters kept referencing paperbacks of these books. Yeah. And there were no paperbacks of those books as far as I had seen from my own research. And then finally someone called it an armed services edition. So I thought, well, what's an armed services edition? So I started researching that. And then I realized this is an incredible story that the US Army thought it would be a good idea to arm troops with books during World War II. And actually 122 million of them were printed and distributed for free from 1943 to 1947. And again, it's back to the FDR, books are weapons in this war of ideas. And so something that I think is just amazing to think about is that in World War II, you know, we think about invasions with weaponry, you know, like tanks and people, you know, advancing with guns. But actually, when Normandy was invaded, troops had banned books in their pockets, books that were banned and burned by Nazi Germany for 10 plus years. And so they were literally invading with ideas, with banned ideas. And it was the idea that we need to get these back into Europe.
That's right.
And it's really just an incredible story. And I thought, how can we not know what these are? How can we have lost this story entirely? And so I just felt an obligation to preserve it and to tell it. And so that's how When Books Went to War came into being.
So you were researching this hoax of a character,
Yes.
a person, but a
Yes.
character, and you saw this acronym, and out of curiosity, you just followed the bouncing ball and discovered this incredible story that, as far as we know, no one has actually ever written about.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you.
We agree. So that brings me to my next question. So we're talking a little bit about archives, and you know, she's used to work in museums, I believe. Is that right? And so archives are very familiar to you, and literally digging through the crates, right?
Right.
When you discovered this ASC, and you discovered this story about the armed forces and the American Library Association and librarians, like really galvanizing to help our troops, one, and to get this material over. Can you talk a little bit about some of the logistics around getting the books? And I don't know if you all saw 6888, but then getting material, like the letters to the troops, to the soldiers. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's this excellent quote from somebody that was fighting in World War II, I think in the China, Burma, India theater, the CBI. And he said, the way that we spell morale out here is M-A-I-L. But the mail, it was not only just the letters, but the armed services editions were mailed to them, because they were scattered across such a broad area that having a library somewhere wouldn't do anything. It wouldn't serve many people. So the only way to get books into their hands was actually to mail them. And so it was incredibly important to receive both the letters but also the books, because you know, they say that war is 9/10 boredom. You're doing nothing most of the time. You're waiting for orders, or you're waiting for action, and then as soon as the action starts, you're hoping it's going to end soon because it's terrible. But having something for all of those lulls in time where you're doing absolutely nothing. You know, this is a time period when we don't have phones in our pockets.
That's right.
They have no electricity. So for a book to actually reach your hands and to be able to have, you know, 10 plus hours of entertainment, that was just incredible. And if your buddy had a book, you'd make arrangements to
sharing.
swap.
That's right. Yeah, like an internal little library. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
I find that interesting to think about this like sort of environment, you know, right? I mean, this audience is pretty young, but I don't know if you remember before when we didn't have cell phones. Like if I said that to my daughter right now, it would just go over her head and under her feet. But there was a time where it was simply the written word, and that's all you had, and you had this like exchange, and you got to sort of experience the world through the written word, right?
Right.
When you think about the letters, you talk a lot about letters in your book, in this particular book, and the importance of that communication. I want to kind of tie this in with the 6888 a little bit so people understand who these women are, because we're going to talk a little bit about women in librarianship and how they created a system, of organization to get those letters out to the troops. Do you have anything to say on that one?
I think that it's really hard to put yourself in the perspective of what it was like to be someone that was fighting in World War II. But basically, your only connection to home possible was the mail. Whether that was letters or also with the books, it transported you home. So to get a story about anything American when you are just in the middle of a jungle, or you're on a Pacific island, or you're someplace in Europe and every road sign is something that you have no idea where you are or how to read it. It was just alienating. It was disorienting. And so to have something arrive, even, you know, the familiar penmanship of like your mother, troops miss their mothers more than anything. There's actually an anecdote that during World War II, if you got injured, troops didn't call for the medic, they called for their mothers first. So to get a letter from your mother was just the most incredible thing. To get a book that talks about a family. That's why A Tree Grows in Brooklyn was so popular.
Right.
It's because it's about a family. It's a complete dysfunctional family, but it's a family. And troops from all over the country would write to Betty Smith, who wrote that book, saying, I felt like even though you were writing about Brooklyn, you were writing about my hometown. And some minor character in the book, that reminds me of my neighbor. Or, my mother used to say that too. Like, it was just all these little connections that they would take out of the book, and it would just make them feel closer to a place that they desperately wanted to return to at a time when they weren't sure that they ever would.
No.
And so the importance of the mail, whether it was letters or books, you can't say enough about how much it impacted their lives.
That's right. And I recall reading that they also created a different size magazine as well. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, so they're out on display. So if you have a chance to look at the display cases before you leave, or if you come back tomorrow, I highly recommend it. They are the cutest magazines you've ever seen in your life. There's Time magazines that are about this big. And what they did is they removed all the advertisements because paper was being rationed.
That's right.
And they're printed on newsprint, so they're very thin pages. But to get like a Time magazine, again, it's that familiar thing that suddenly arrives. And just to show you how small the Armed Services editions are, we took one out of the display case before the presentation. But I have one in my pocket, and this is The Great Gatsby. The entire book, The Great Gatsby. And you can see it fits in my pocket. So the idea behind the Armed Services editions was to create a truly pocket-sized book. So it's really the smallest book I think that has ever been mass-produced. And what they had to do was, it's so small, they had to print it on a magazine press, and it was double height, and then they'd slice them in half. So in the display cases, there are some that are still connected, that have two books, one on top of the other. But they were really so small that it was not hard for a soldier to carry them around.
I'll have to be careful because this is a collector's item. I don't know if you can see, but it goes from left to right. I was reading the book and I was like, I'm trying to understand what that looked like exactly. I won't open that one, but this is perfect. So they actually made two sizes. Is that correct? They made the smaller one, then there was one slightly larger for the cargo pocket, right?
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly.
So talking about your book emphasizes how books can shape and influence wartime experience. I think we talked a little bit about that. Do you think books can have a cultural power and importance in contemporary times? So let me talk a little bit. Let me talk that question out a little bit. So I understand through your book and through just my own knowledge that books have really it's a cornerstone of communication, of education, of literacy, all of that. Mm-hmm. What do you see books still having the written book, that same relevance and that same cultural place today as they did 80 years ago, 70, 80 years ago?
I do. I'm probably biased towards saying that, but I just think books are such an important part of, I think, any democracy, really, because it allows us to live lives that we will never live. It allows us to visit places we will never visit, whether they're imaginary or real. But they give us the opportunity to experience other ways of looking at things. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole body of knowledge about what books can do for us, including things like bibliotherapy and stuff like that. But it's the idea that when we read, we often are sort of subconsciously improving ourselves over the course of encountering characters or encountering certain situations. And so if you have a bold character that's doing something very brave, it might subtly inspire you to be more brave. So it's things like that. And then, when you're going through a rough period in your life, if you have a book that purely allows you to escape and have that respite, and that's what soldiers learned.
That's right.
Sometimes you just want something easy to read that's not demanding at all. You don't have to think too hard, and it's just pure entertainment. But it allows you to forget something that you might want to forget for a little bit. Mm-hmm. But they're tools to allow us to get information and to improve ourselves and to educate ourselves and entertain ourselves. So I just think they serve so many purposes in our lives that I think it's just something that we will always gravitate towards. I don't know. I have a young daughter, and she loves to read, and it's not because I push books on her.
Right.
But I think that she honestly just gets so much enjoyment out of exploring all of these different characters and different scenarios that we just ordinarily wouldn't encounter.
I also have a young daughter who absolutely loves to read, and every time I take her to work, she beelines to the kids section while I'm talking to the staff. She always leaves with material, or she sends me to get it, one of the two. And I couldn't be more proud. I remember putting something on social media. I was like, my work is done here, right? I've cultivated a reader. I have created a reader just by nature of the work that I do, the way in which I can see the librarians clapping, just by the way that I have introduced her to literature. And that will stay with her. So I do agree with you with that one.
And they have the option of tablets and all of the modern technology.
Yes, and she uses that too. I mean, she uses it all, like tablets, phones, real books, paperbacks.
But that they still choose books, I think shows the timelessness of them.
That's right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about a couple of folks in this book. Let's talk about Troutman versus Taft. And let's orient the audience to Althea Warren, who was the head librarian of the Los Angeles Public Library. And I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce our dear city librarian back in the back, who's like probably super embarrassed by now, Mr. John Sabos. I think my mic went off. He now holds the position that Althea used to hold. So let's talk about these characters in your book.
So initially, the U.S. military...
I beg your pardon, they're not characters, they're real.
They're larger than life, it feels, though, so I understand. But initially, the U.S. military was not gung-ho over spending any money on books, right? This was a war. They felt that all of the budget should be going towards things like just weapons, you know, guns, tanks, uniforms, just all of the things that you would need to fight a war. And they didn't really appreciate, from a military standpoint, the idea that, well, books are also weapons. You know, that just was like, no. So there was no military budget for books, and yet they had a chief librarian who was Troutman, Ray Troutman, and he was supposed to raise an army of books so that troops could read them, but they gave him no money to do that. So
I don't know, that sounds familiar.
What? Libraries not getting an adequate budget?
It seems like I've heard this story before.
I don't know. That would never happen today.
Never.
No. But so he had to deal with this situation of, it's basically an impossible mission. But what he did is he collaborated with civilian librarians, and civilian librarians were eager to do their part because they were talking about how important books were in this climate where they had watched these book burnings across Germany, and there was these lists in the 1930s in Germany of just authors and titles of thousands and thousands of books that had to be removed from bookshelves in Germany. And then as Germany invaded across Europe, all of the nations that Germany occupied went through the same book purgings. It's estimated actually that over 100 million books were destroyed across Europe during World War II. But as librarians in the United States are reading about this, they felt they never wanted to have to do that to their own bookshelves. And so they already well understood that books were a way to fight, and they had to be on the shelves to do that. And so this group of librarians came together, and they created something called the Victory Book Campaign. The Victory Book Campaign was the largest civilian book drive in history. And so they advertised, and some of the posters are out in the display cases, they advertised that the public needed to donate good books that would go to troops. So donated books are free, so there goes the budget problem.
Again, this sounds so familiar.
I don't know, you don't know what you're talking about.
Never.
Budgets for
Never
libraries
would someone make us like think that we could just have donated books rather than buy new ones. No one would ever do that.
No.
No.
But back then they did, but not today. So 10 million books were donated in 1942 by the American public for Army libraries, and then they renewed the campaign in 1943. But Althea Warren was chosen to spearhead the Victory Book Campaign in 1942, and it was really an amazing choice because to pick a female librarian to head a national campaign was actually an incredibly bold move on behalf of all librarians who participated in this. But she had this idea of people should read whatever they want. And so she believed that libraries should be welcoming places where you don't shush people for being too loud and things like that. You just welcome everybody in your doors. And she was like a matchmaker, where she wanted to connect you to the perfect book for whatever you enjoyed reading.
Yeah.
And so she wanted to do the same thing for soldiers. And so she just tirelessly devoted herself to this task. And unfortunately, there was a Senator, Taft, who believed that a man would do a better job, and he would put her down because he thought she was never doing enough, despite 10 million books in 1942. And so she was on temporary leave from her position at the LA Library, so she ended up going back after that period expired. But then Taft later on caused even more trouble for the book programs, because after the Victory Book Campaign stopped because the Armed Services editions were being printed,
Right.
On the eve of the 1944 election, Congress realized that there wasn't really a good way to provide soldiers the opportunity to vote, because voting legislation didn't exist that had a long enough period of time for a soldier to ask for an absentee ballot,
Right.
get it, fill it out, and then send it back to the United States. That could take like 90 to 120 days, because again, mail
Right.
had some delays associated with it. And so there were debates in Congress about passing a soldier voting law that would ease this whole process. In the course of doing that, Taft thought that because FDR was a Democrat running for a controversial fourth term, that FDR would send Democratic, as in the party, propaganda and political tracts to soldiers to try to sway the entire soldier vote to vote for him.
Right.
So into this soldier voting law slipped this provision that said that nobody in the US government could provide books, magazines, or newspapers that had a political argument in it to troops. And if you did so, it was a criminal act, and so you could be fined $1,000 and or jailed for up to a year. And so all of a sudden, these Armed Services editions, it's hard to find a book that doesn't say anything political. Like if you're really looking for it, you'll find it. And so the whole program was put into jeopardy, because you don't want to go to jail over sending books to troops, and you certainly don't want to be fined $1,000. And so what Troutman did, who was the chief librarian of the Army, is he decided that as books were being pulled off Army library shelves, he thought the most ridiculous examples should be provided to the press. And since he was working with all these major publishers who happened to have PR departments, he would just let the publishers know of some of these really ridiculous bans and books that were being banned, and then the PR department spread it to the newspapers. And then all of a sudden people were reading that soldiers fighting for democracy could not read the same books that people
That's
at home
right.
could read,
Right.
because they were being banned by an act of Congress. Americans across the country, it didn't matter what state you were, whether it was red or blue or what political persuasion you ascribed to, Americans came out in droves to protest this, because they just felt like, what are we even fighting for if we're banning the ideas and we're saying soldiers can't read political things because that might influence the way that they think.
And vote, right?
And vote.
Yeah.
And vote. And so within 2 months, the law was completely amended. There was no more criminal penalties. Any book could be sent, any newspaper, any magazine. And so it's really an interesting look at how America responded to book bans at a time when democracy was under attack. And it just seemed like the consensus was books are central to democracy.
Right.
Picking and selecting titles that you can and cannot read, that's not democracy. And people should just have the freedom to choose whatever they want.
So more information, more choices was how it was handled before.
Exactly.
Whereas today we see it's being handled in a completely different way.
Exactly. And what's actually interesting is in 1943, when FDR gave that speech saying books are weapons in the war of ideas, flags across the United States were flown at half-mast to recognize the huge number of books that had already been destroyed across Europe. And so to mourn the destruction of books as a nation, it's really interesting to think about that reaction to compared to the climate of today.
That's right. You know, I was thinking when I was reading your book, and that part of the book where there are over 1 million books or materials that were burned or destroyed, you know, that's the first way to take down a community, to take down a nation, is to erase them of their history.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I think your book quoted that Hitler was able to conquer most of Europe within 12 months.
It was such a swift, it was just like a bulldozer just going across Europe. And it was interesting because really it was attacking thought and ideas first. And if you can demoralize somebody, it's easier to take advantage of them, or it's easier to get your way because you've made them feel like this is hopeless. I'm not even going to bother to fight. It was very effective. The propaganda and the removal of ideas really did impact the way that nations fought. Like for France, for example, I mean, France had defeated Germany in World War I. In World War II, France capitulated in 6 weeks.
That's right.
Because for such a long time, there had been this massive influx of news stories, and they even had whispering campaigns where they sent German agents into France who had perfect French accents to just whisper things, rumors about how, you know, there's this new weapon that Germany has, and if they use that, you know, it's over. But just to create doubts in people's minds, and it was just incredibly effective.
And along that line, I recall reading that there was, they leveraged media, which at that time was really radio.
Yeah.
And they used it for the United States, American accent, or people with American accents for the German propaganda. And it was picked up in a lot of ways. Obviously not to the extent that it was in France or other European nations, but it's interesting to see the tactics, see the strategy of bringing people into the German ideology and the German fold.
Yeah. One thing that Germany would do too was target American soldiers, because American soldiers, if you could get your hands on a radio, and sometimes German soldiers had these little portable radios, and so if they abandoned them in a field or whatever, if you found a radio, that was like the jackpot, because now you could listen to music and all sorts of things that you really missed. And so Germany had all of these propaganda radio stations, and they did hire people with perfect accents to replicate like an American news program, and they would have all of these messages to demoralize American soldiers and try to convince them to surrender, interspersed with popular American songs that you would definitely want to listen to. So, you know, it's that play on ideas of, should I surrender? Like, they're saying that it's hopeless on the radio, but is it?
Right, right. So let's take a quick pivot here and talk a little bit about. Actually, I meant to ask you this a little bit earlier. So I kind of alluded to the 6888, and what I didn't mention is that battalion, I think that's what they're called. They were all African American women. So let's talk a little bit about the soldiers, because obviously African American soldiers were present in World War II. How do you know whether or not those soldiers also had access to books and material? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
So they would have access to books and material. And I guess I'll tell you a story that's going to be in my next book. But, you know, there was a strict policy of racial segregation across the military during World War II. And so that led to having to have separate mess halls, having separate service clubs and things like that. And Eleanor Roosevelt received a letter from a mother who said, my son is in the U.S. Army, and he happens to be African American.
That's right.
And his service club has no books. Meanwhile, at the same post, the white service club has all of their bookshelves are filled. Can you do something about that? And Eleanor Roosevelt would, and she did. So she took that letter and she sent it to the Chief of Staff of the Army, George Marshall. And George Marshall tended to get a lot of letters of complaint from Eleanor Roosevelt. And so he had a policy that every letter from her had to be investigated, and then he had to report back. So Marshall gets this letter about libraries. What is he going to do about libraries? And so he forwards it to the Chief Librarian of the Army, which is Ray Trotman. And now it's his problem. And so actually what Ray Trotman did is he wrote to Howard University and he said, I'd imagine that you would know what the most popular books are that I could put on all of the shelves of the Black Service Clubs.
Right.
So if you would be willing to send me a list, those are the books that we will buy.
Yeah.
And so they did send a list, and they also included magazines. So in Black Service Clubs, they had the NAACP's The Crisis. And then they had the finest.
Which would be deemed highly political, I would presume.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
But, and Trotman was the type of person where he kind of followed the same mentality of Althea Warren, where it's, if that's what people want to read, then that's what I'm going to give them. Because, I mean, all of you have read a book that you have loved, and you know the experience of having a page turner where you just, like, you can't even fall asleep at night because it's such a good book that it just keeps you awake.
Yeah.
But you've also had books where you just can't get into it. And that's okay. I think there's too many books in the world to stay with that one. So it's okay, I think, that to find one that you like. But for soldiers, Trotman really wanted to give them books that had the highest likelihood of being the page-turning kind. And I should note, during World War II, the soldiers in the Army, they were not readers of books before they entered the military.
I was going to get to that.
Yeah, they read magazines.
The military essentially creating a culture of readers.
Right. And it was because they were free, books were free, and they were there. And if you're stuck, in a waiting room, and you don't have your phone for some reason, there's nothing for you to do, and you're going to have a pretty long wait. If you saw something that you could read to pass the time, you'd probably want to pick something up and pass the time. And soldiers turned to books just because they had nothing else, and they were bored. And then they realized they actually enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought your book did a great job at kind of like exploring this idea of when they came home. We could talk a little bit about the GI Bill and how that was, how segregation ended up being obviously big at that point in time and even being perpetuated. But the idea that when the soldiers came home, that they started to leverage the public library more because they had become readers. What I didn't have time to research is, like, how did that sort of play into, this big boom of public library use and public librarianship? I didn't get that far, but I wonder if there is a nexus to all of these servicemen and women coming home and really loving literature where they didn't before. That was the most interesting part. They didn't leave readers, but they came home readers.
They did, and there's an article that the American Library Association printed right after VE Day, just a warning to all librarians, because there was literally an army of brand new book readers that were coming home, and they were discriminating readers. They had taste, and they were, so you had to be ready for them. And there was that huge influx of people that wanted to use the public library, because troops, of course, got the books for free, so they still weren't used to buying books.
Right.
And so,
naturally.
Right. So where do you get a free book? You go to the library. You borrow it.
That's right.
And they were used to reading it and then swapping for another title. So the idea of borrowing something briefly for free, they were well versed in that.
Yes, I love it. Before I continue, I want to be able to have you interact a little bit with Molly. Does anyone have a question? So the question was, how were the titles of the books decided upon?
So there was like a 3-tier process. So first, publishers created lists of titles that they thought would appeal to young men, because most of the Army was young men.
Right.
So that was first. And then they sent those lists and to the Army and the Navy. And then there were readers. This was a job which I would absolutely love to have. Readers.
We still have that job, I think. It's in collection development.
Really? Can I apply? But for the readers, they'd read the books, and they were looking for, if there's anything offensive, they didn't want to send books that were going to be derogatory towards a certain group or things like that. They wanted books to be something that were accepting and welcoming of all people. So readers.
There were some that were salacious too, right?
So yes. So actually, that's funny. So some of the readers were supposed to flag just anything that seemed potentially problematic. And so some of them were reading, there was 2 titles in particular, Forever Amber.
Right.
and Strange Fruit. Both books, as one soldier said, had sex scenes in a lot of them. And that's what the soldiers actually wanted to read. But those books were also banned in Boston and other conservative cities across the United States because they were considered obscene and indecent. And so some of the readers just flagged, these books have passages that some may find potentially, indecent. And so all of these top publishers had to come together, and they had these board meetings. So you have like Richard Simon of Simon and Schuster, and you have W.W. Norton of like Norton Publishing. So you have all of these like literary, bigwigs in a room, and they have this order of business to discuss whether they should be sending books with sex scenes in them. And I don't know what the conversation was like, but in the minutes, it said, we have agreed that if troops want books that that provide a release, then we should be obliged to give them that.
No comment.
So, no, that was their word. And so they sent these books to troops, and troops sent loads of letters just thanking the publishers for sending them the types of books that they wanted to read.
Well, and then if you think about it, obviously these young people, these young men mostly, they were risking their lives every day. There was another part in your book where they talk about how books help them release, in that they wake up with their comrades, their colleagues, their friends, and then by the night they may not be there, and oftentimes they weren't there. So from that vantage point, I can completely see why are we splitting hairs? These are 18-year-old adult men, right? So I can see that. But just to get back to her question, there was another part. I thought it was a librarian. I thought it was Althea Warren. Wasn't there someone, or maybe it was the reader, who took out gardening or took out women-themed material to make sure that they aligned with the sort of more masculine idea of maleness or something? Did I read that?
So there was a belief that men only wanted, I think it was, the quote was manly man books.
That's what it was. That's what it was.
But what's really funny is that for the women in the Women's Army Corps, the Army actually made sets of magazines that were all women's magazines. So Cosmopolitan and Vogue
Home
and things
and Garden
like that.
Or whatever it was
right.
at the time.
And so what turned out though is that the women never got the magazines. And that's because the men enjoyed looking at the women's fashion magazines because they hadn't seen any women lately. And so they were taking all of the women's magazines from them. And it turns out that actually some of the most popular armed services editions were about women and by women. Mm-hmm. And it's because they missed their mothers and they just missed women.
Yeah, and I was thinking when you said that, magazines of home or home and garden or whatever it would be, I wondered if that reminded them of their home, right?
Exactly.
So it makes a lot of sense when you really think about it.
Right.
Do we have another question? Yes, ma'am.
This is off track a little bit, but my understanding, could be wrong, was that there's some connection between the American paperbacks going over and the development of the Penguin paperback, because that's where the size started. Did the British also have a similar program, or did the U.S., spin off of that development of that paperback format?
So it's basically the development of the paperback compared to the Armed Services edition. So the paperback did start out in England earlier than in the United States, and that started in the late 30s. Yeah, exactly. So the Penguins were there. The U.S. publishing industry had absolutely no interest in publishing paperbacks because a paperback was sold for 25 cents.
I was just going to say they're cheap.
Right. You could sell a hardcover, though, for up to $4. And so you'd much rather have the profit margin on a hardcover than a soft cover. And the other thing was bookstores thought that they were ugly. Paperbacks were not, because the hardcovers had these handsome covers, and sometimes they had gilt lettering.
That's right.
Right. So even here, you don't see any paperbacks. So bookstores didn't want to carry them in the United States. So there was kind of no market. And so what ended up happening is in 1939, the first paperback company started in the United States, but no popular books, no bestsellers were ever printed as paperbacks. They only printed classics that were in the public domain, mysteries, and westerns. And so what ended up happening is the Armed Services editions, when traditional publishers agreed to print them, they were so fearful of these ending up anywhere in the domestic market because they thought it would depress book sales.
Right.
Why would you buy a hardcover book if you could get a free paperback? So they had to be sent directly overseas. They were not supposed to be in the United States at all. And what actually ended up happening is publishers realized that the troops that were reading paperbacks would never purchase a hardcover book anyway.
Right.
When they came back from war, they weren't going to be hardcover customers. And what it did was it opened their eyes to the idea that you could have a whole separate market of people who wanted to read, but they wanted only paperbacks. And the people that liked hardcovers would continue to buy hardcovers at whatever price you charged. And so the Armed Services editions actually gave American publishers the confidence to print paperbacks.
Mm-hmm.
And so after the war, it went from, I think, around 200,000 paperbacks printed per year in 1939 to like 40 million a year at the end of the war. And then it just burgeoned so that in the 1950s, more paperbacks were printed than hardcovers in the United States.
I'm sure a lot of them fell apart from all the readings, but was there a prohibition about bringing those Armed Services editions back into the United States by the soldiers?
So soldiers were writing to publishers saying, can we please buy these? Because we would like them in our home libraries, which they never had a library in their life, but for the home libraries that we're planning to start. And the publisher said, no, these aren't for sale. You know, they are supposed to disintegrate in a war zone. So troops started saving them. And they did bring them home, and there was no way to stop them from doing that. Some got so desperate they mailed boxes of books home because they really truly wanted to have a home library. Because the thing was, like, you know, you referenced the man who said, you know, it's a weird lifestyle where you have breakfast with a man and by dinner time he's been buried.
Right.
So some people stopped making friends because it was too painful to make friends because you'd lose them. But in books, they had friends, and those friends couldn't be lost. And so it was almost like bringing your friends with you to carry a book in your pocket. And sometimes,
I hadn't thought of it that way.
yeah, if you loved a character, you actually wouldn't trade that book unless it was like your very best friend and you were going to get it back. But that was like having a friend in your pocket that you could go back to, and you knew who they were because you learned about them over the course of hundreds of pages.
Wow.
So it was also that, like, I need to bring my friends home with me.
No,
And it was in books.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Are there lessons learned from World War II that we can use today to talk, especially younger people, I think, into putting the phone down and picking a book up?
You know, I think I love the soldiers' letters, and the book quotes a lot of soldiers' letters, but I think that there's a satisfaction in reading a book over, I think, social media posts and things like that, because there's more of a connection. Like, again, if you feel like you've made a friend out of a character in a book, like we've all had the experience where you love a character in a book or it's a biography and you just have so much respect for that person that when you get to the last page, you are so sorry because you're not going to have new experiences with that character because you got to the end. Mm-hmm. I think there's a satisfaction in that. So I think it's a matter of them having that experience. And that gets down to, like, if you don't like the book, stop reading, but find one that you do. And that's the value of libraries and librarians, because you can, like Althea Warren being a matchmaker of, well, what do you enjoy? I think you'll enjoy this character in this book. And then that just starts that pattern and that habit.
And in the defense of those same teens, I will say a lot of times those teens are reading digital books. They're not strictly, I'll speak for my child, they're not strictly on social media. She doesn't even have social media. They have avenues of learning on the phone too. I think we do ourselves a disservice to try and get them to stop. We have to figure out how to infiltrate because this is how they get their information. It's not going away. So as a parent, we got to figure out how to be there. Right here, and then we're going to go here.
So I just finished volunteering in a high school in New York for 8.5 years. The fact that people believe that teenagers aren't reading is a myth. they are reading.
We
They
agree.
read certain
Yeah.
genres. They read science fiction. They read dystopian novels. Kids carry around those novels all day long.
They do.
So they are reading. They're just maybe not reading the things that we would want them to read, or other, they have broken out certain genres, but they're definitely reading.
And there's
Yeah.
a long librarian history. I mean, someone could argue exactly the opposite of what I'm about to say, but give them what they want.
Yeah.
Let them read what they want to read, and then eventually they'll get to wherever they need to go on their literary journey. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make one point. A year ago, I think I sat in this exact same room with you speaking about banned books. And you were also talking about books being banned, whether they were salacious or not. This problem has, not that this is all about banned books, this is about books that they're allowed to read, but the problem with banned books just keeps going. It keeps perpetuating itself. And it's really sad.
Yeah.
I agree. This has
too.
been going on since the beginning of time. I've done some research about, the monastic libraries in Catholic churches and the early days of censorship, going back to 200 or 300 BC. Like this is continuing on. It will always be here. People will always have a difference of opinion. I think one of our jobs is to remind all of us that a difference of opinion is fine. But that's my opinion, and I shouldn't be making you believe the same thing that I believe. That's not democracy, nor is that a way to create a culture of reading. I think we have two more questions, and I think we have to split. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to clarify. The idea of having the books begins with this idea on the part of the president that he wants to put ideas into the hands, the minds of the GIs that are fighting a war that begins with books being banned and ideas being destroyed. And yet, the selection of the books is not being made by the government. The selection of the books is being made by librarians and maybe even more so, publishers.
Well, no, the Army and the Navy, once that process went through where the librarians and the publishers made their lists, the Army and the Navy would go through it. Because actually sometimes the publishers thought, you ought to like Shakespeare. You should like.
Well, why don't you tell them about Great Gatsby?
So like for the Great Gatsby, so this was a failure. This was a complete failure during F. Scott Fitzgerald's life. He wanted it to be the great American novel, and the public didn't buy it. And so the last royalty check that he received was based on copies of the book he purchased himself. And so fast forward into the World War II era, the publishers were running out of books that were appropriate, the manly man books, that would appeal to young men. And so they started to have it go back into time into much older books. And I think just based on the recognition of the name F. Scott Fitzgerald, they thought, we'll just send this. 155,000 copies of that were sent overseas, and troops actually liked it, And I don't know what it was, because there's no letters to F. Scott Fitzgerald saying, geez, I loved this scene, because he passed away. But I think it's the fantasy of it. And the thing is, soldiers, their letters were censored. They weren't allowed to say where they were, what they were doing, any context clues at all, but they could say what book they were reading. That was not censored. So they would write home and say, well, I'm reading The Great Gatsby. And then people at home wanted that connection to their loved one, so they would buy The Great Gatsby at home. And that's how The Gatsby was actually rescued from obscurity. It's thanks to the soldiers who enjoyed it and told their loved ones to read it.
1 and 2? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my dad was in the Army Air Force. He says they were told in training to put the little books in their pocket, and he had one that had a very hard cover on
Yes.
it to protect their heart.
I've heard that
okay.
before too.
So there is the Heart Shield Bible that was marketed. Yeah, it's a gold-plated, because style. It was a gold-plated Bible, but it had a stainless steel cover, and the advertisement said that it could deflect bullets, which I'm not sure about that, and shrapnel. And so you're supposed to wear it in your pocket. I will say though, and maybe I just think too critically, but if you have a shiny thing hanging out of your pocket, like you weren't allowed to smoke cigarettes except a certain way, because if there was a reflection of light, that's how you would be targeted. So if the sun hit the cover of your Bible, but anyway, that was a true thing, but it was Heart Shield Bibles, and it said like, may this shield your heart from harm or something on the front.
We have one more question, and I swear we're leaving.
Hi, so publishers will stop printing books that people are not buying. I've worked in bookstores and cases of books go back all the time. One thing that I did and got all my friends to do this past holiday was go out and buy as many banned books as you can and give them out to all your friends, because we have to keep these books and ideas in circulation. So I encourage all of you to try
That's
and you
the
can
best.
request them from your library. Yeah.
Buy them and request them. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm sorry we went over a little bit. Molly Guptill Manning.